Hi, Kelly. Thank you so much for doing this interview.
Hello.
Do you want to start by just saying a few words about yourself, introducing yourself to the students?
Sure. So I'm Kelly, as you know. I'm currently a professor at Ryerson University in Toronto, where I'm currently trying to think through how race and species are produced and inform sort of our penchant for caging in terms of settler colonial theory, punishment studies, and the like.
Thank you. So you're a professor of criminology in particular at Ryerson, and before that you were a professor of environmental sociology and the sociology of food at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, based on my understanding. So before that, though, you were a PhD student at the University of Alberta. And during your degree, you taught this feminism and food course a number of times, and you also wrote your dissertation on food ontologies, including the role of law in those ontologies. So I wondered if you could say a bit about this work, what drew you to the topic of food ontologies and law, and what arguments did you make on that topic?
Yes, absolutely. So there were a number of factors that sort of drew me to the question of food ontology at the time that these ideas were sort of coming to the fore. Chloe, you and I were talking about like what is and what isn't food. In these broader contexts, I saw animal and food activists making claims about what food is and isn't. And this was also happening at the same time that multiple lawsuits against plant-based products were making the news. So basically, it seemed like a lot of people and corporations were making ontological claims, though of course they're not using these terms, about what food was and about what it wasn't. And so things I was seeing in activist campaigns included slogans like, real food has mud, not blood. It's not meat, it's murder. And on the other hand, lawsuits for their part often entail consumers or corporations suing the makers of plant-based products for false advertising, saying vegan cheese couldn't be called cheese because it didn't contain dairy, and that soy milk couldn't be called milk because it wasn't made from the secretions of a hoofed animal. The company Field Roast in Canada, who call themselves a vegan meat company, were also sued, saying that they couldn't call their product meat because it didn't contain animal flesh. But if you look sort of at the history of the word meat, it just means food that is of substance. So all this is happening. And then there's also at the same time a broader context of proposed revisions to the US Food Guide, in which the expert scientific panel convened by the government concluded that they could only recommend plant-based diets for the US population, given the harmful effects to humans who consume an animal-based diet and the detrimental environmental impacts of animal agriculture. So at this time, there's all these sort of events happening. Michael Pollan's best-selling Food Rules book was also informing sort of the popular imagination. And in this book, he puts forth what he calls simple rules about what is and what isn't food. So he'll make claims about what real food is, so something your grandmother would recognize, and what real food isn't, which he calls like soy-based imposters, for example. So it was against this backdrop that I wanted to understand how we arrived at these dominant definitions of what real food is and what real food isn't. So I started researching the US and Canada's settler colonial history to see where these ontologies, particularly of animal products being the only real food. So where did these beliefs come from? And what I found and argued is that, of course, this is rooted in colonial private property relationships to land and to animals that inform and are reproduced by animal agriculture. And then these are beliefs and norms that came up against Indigenous ways of relating and knowing about what life meant, what humanity and animality meant. So I sort of went to the archive and started looking about these claims about like, what is real food? What's the proper way to relate to land? How do we understand what makes a human, what makes an animal an animal? And animal agriculture is just sort of permeating throughout all of this. So ultimately, in this dissertation, I argued that these deeply entrenched notions of real food as animal-based are inherently yoked to settler colonial ways of producing white supremacy, land dispossession, and dominance over the more than human world. So while lawsuits about what can or cannot be called milk or meat might just look like they're about labeling, I argued that this was really about maintaining colonial supremacy and the ontologies of life that inform this, and that these are produced through what we call food and how we make this food, right? So there's something distinct about animal agriculture in terms of structuring our ways of life, who we believe, right, is a full human through what they eat and who isn't. And it was very important when colonists arrived in the New World, or what they called the New World, they were very surprised and shocked that it wasn't sort of this gardened agricultural landscape, right?
Mhm.
And they thought that was really missing. So they positioned animal ag as civilized, the proper way to relate to animals and land. And this was a reason that they also used to justify their colonial project and presence.
So this language of real food, we hear a lot when people, even vegans and vegetarians, will refer to plant-based meats as fake meat or faux meat and faux cheese, or spelling cheese with a Z instead of an SE. And are you opposed to those kinds of words and spellings following your dissertation research, or do you think we should just call these meat and cheese?
I think I don't have a strong position about this. I'm not sure if we need words like cheese. I think if you want to disrupt this idea that the animal or the use of the animal is central to what real food is, and if real food has to have these labels for people to consume it and change how they might want to think about themselves in relation to the more than human world, perhaps it's a good intervention. But on the other hand, people who don't want to eat animal products seek out these products because they're not animal products. So I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. I think sometimes I myself will use that language of faux, and then I'll sort of correct myself and be like, it's not any less real food just because it's plant-based cheese. It's not fake cheese. It's soy meat. It's not fake meat, and soy and plants are just as real as animal products. So I find myself using that language, but then also sort of correcting myself. I remember you also wrote on the legal case around mayonnaise, right? With them saying you can't call it mayonnaise unless it's got eggs. And also the argument was disingenuous often, that they, on the part of these corporations, saying it would confuse consumers. They're going to be wanting animal products and just accidentally buy these things if you label them cheese and meat and mayonnaise, as though consumers aren't buying these specifically because they don't want those products. But do you want to say anything
Yeah,
about Mailgate? Was it
absolutely.
called?
Yeah, it was called Egg, I think. Basically, The Guardian sort of did an expose on this through a lot of freedom of information emails that they accessed, but it was basically government officials, the heads of egg producing corporations, and people sort of in these senior and executive roles that sort of conspired to launch this lawsuit against I think it's Just Mayo was the company, and they were conspiring to, because they saw this as a real threat to their industry. So they figured they looked for ways that they could mobilize the FDA in order to issue warning letters and then seek to have all the labels changed because and the basis was that it would confuse consumers and that of course it didn't have eggs in it and it had to. And then another one, if multiple petitions through the FDA don't seek a change in how people label their products, then they usually try and have lawmakers propose a law. So the Dairy Pride Act is one of these laws that wants to have what they call truth in labeling, I think were their terms. But yes, a lot of it was about what they would argue to a judge is that it confused the consumer. And the judges usually throughout these cases saying people buy these products because they know they're not dairy products. Like the average consumer is not going to be confused by this. They're seeking out soy milk or almond milk because it is not dairy milk. And then I remember tracing it to, there was one particular lawyer who was launching all these lawsuits. So if one got thrown out in one court or one state, they would just find another citizen in whose name they launched the complaint. So it just seemed like a concerted effort by a threatened or multiple threatened industries around this labeling issue.
In your dissertation, you also took a position on cultured or in vitro meat, which is a topic that we've spent some time on in this course. I wondered if you could discuss the position that you took back then, and also whether your thoughts have changed at all on that topic over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I wrote the dissertation, I argued that agricultural power is a term that we ought to be thinking in or about, right? As distinct set of practices that target bodies. So our bodies, right, in terms of our digestion, our diets, and the health implications of that, but that also target most resoundingly, right, the bodies of animals and also the land for exploitation. And so I argue that agricultural power is a distinct set of practices, but that it also produces dominant understandings of food and ourselves and others. And of course, like we can think of agricultural power to think about the origins of COVID too, and how it structures life and entails political responses and stuff like that. But when I was writing the dissertation, at the time I was writing, in vitro meat required the use of animal cells or tissues to grow the meat itself, right? You needed cells from a slaughtered animal or a live animal to start the culture. You needed bovine fetal serum, which they sourced from slaughterhouses, as a broth for incubating the cells. And so it wasn't divorced from the animal agricultural complex or the animal industrial complex that we know and that we're critical of. And so because farmed animals were still required, at that time I argued that in vitro meat represented a shift more accurately in where agricultural power was applied. So from the body or flesh of the cell that required the death of the farmed animal to the cell of the farmed animal. But what I say more accurately, because of course it still relies on animal agriculture as we know it. So that's what I wrote at the time. I still think that's the case. There are alternatives, right? You can use like a mushroom broth to incubate the cells. So there are proposed alternatives, and then there are sort of these tech-oriented promises about the future potential, saying, oh, you just need one umbilical cord from a pig, and then you'd have enough cells to culture to feed the entire world forever. So there were sort of these fantastical ideas. So I don't know where the science is to date. I haven't checked recently, but I think it is still true that this does represent agricultural power and perhaps just its modified location of application. But at the same time, I am persuaded by, I was talking with Darren Chang about this the other day, and he took a really practical approach, saying it's likely the case that many people just won't want to or won't be able to be vegan for a number of reasons, whether that is food access issues, etc. And so perhaps in vitro meat would be a compromise that would be vastly better for the environment, animals, and humans. But of course, those who are producing cultured meat say that it is by and large better for the environment, human and animals. And then some critical animal studies scholars are questioning its positive environmental claims. So there's that issue that I haven't quite resolved. One issue that I do plan to spend more time thinking about is the issue of what type of labor would be required for in vitro or cultured meat. So we know that slaughterhouse labor is terrible for employees, as well as, of course, the animals, in terms of leading to spillover effects in the community as well. Not only is it incredibly violent work, psychologically damaging and numbing, physically dangerous, in which workers are crushed, lose limbs, are more likely to develop various cancers, etc. There's a spillover effect of violence into the communities and the families of slaughterhouse workers in terms of sexual assault and other forms of violence. And I think in vitro meat would be a different type of labor. So in that sense, I'm finding myself more in favor of it than I used to be, if we think the world might not change how it eats quickly enough.
Your PhD, you wrote a separate article titled The Present Referent, Non-Human Animal Sacrifice in the Constitution of Dominant Albertan Identity. So I wondered if you could perhaps say a bit about Adam's concept of the absent referent and your idea of the present referent, as well as your argument about meat and identity in this province.
Absolutely. So Carol Adams, in her book, The Sexual Politics of Meat, which I think has now been republished, has 3 editions. Is that right? So yeah, so Carol Adams, of course, is sort of this very well-known person in vegan studies, animal studies, and her argument informs a lot of the way that I think social movements organize around these issues and the way that those looking for social justice and change frame their arguments. And so what she argues is that for the consumption of farmed animals to be palatable, we have to divorce the flesh on our plate from the fact that meat was once a living creature who had their own interests and lives that did not entail becoming a commodity for our consumption. And so she'll argue that the farmed animal has to be absented and that this happens in three ways: through their death, through our language, and through metaphor. And so through death, of course, is through their slaughter, and thus, right, their absence as living is then achieved, right? They're turned into food for humans. And then through language, so she'll say this is about how we rename things, right? That obfuscates their origin. So a calf becomes veal, cows become beef, pigs become bacon. And then thirdly, humans use animalized experiences to describe their experiences. So saying things like, I was treated like a piece of meat, things like that. So she'll say these sort of ways, these three ways, right, allow us to deny the reality of how our food is made and that this was a creature, right, with very different interests than becoming something we ate at dinner or lunch or breakfast. I was reading Adam's work actually and taking the first iteration of this feminism in food class many years ago. And at the same time I'm reading Adams, there's also this art poster project centered on the theme of meat that was happening throughout Edmonton. And so what I was seeing was a turn in these posters that centered on meat themes. And this was sort of a design agency, if I recall correctly, who sort of solicited submissions for a meat themed summer. And then the best ones they produced, they printed, and then they sort of postered throughout Edmonton. They were in the windows of the Garneau or the Transcend in Garneau neighborhood. So locations like this. And all these sort of pieces around meat not necessarily entailed this absent referent that Adam said explains how we can consume animals. The animals were there. So in this article and through using these posters and sort of the broader politics of the region, I argue that because ranching and cowboy masculinity, so this idea of like this colonial conquering of a wild and indigenous frontier, is so central to dominant Albertan identity that there was no need for the referent to be absent. So farmed animal domination and death was seen as required and in fact loyal to regional identities and interests. So the animal didn't need to be hidden to enable meat eating the way that Adam suggests it does. And this is similar to what others have argued, that the blood of the animal, which signifies like our human domination of nature, in part is what makes meat desirable and good. So ultimately, I thought that sort of such a strong regional identity centered on the exploitation of nature and its resources, so animals, oil, and gas, just didn't require this obfuscation. In fact, it was seen as a good, we could say, quote unquote, or a required sacrifice that was central to the economy and central to dominant Albertan identity, which is not as diverse, we could say, as other regions. Oh, very white. And then there's sort of a continuity of political power, with the exception of the NDP government for one term.
Thank you. You wrote one article during your PhD called Eating Animals to Build Rapport. So here you and your co-author wrote about the ethics and politics of being a guest, particularly in our role as researchers, and whether this requires us to eat what's served to us or what is culturally normative, wherever we are conducting research and situated as a guest. And that could be like the ethical reasons of being a good guest, but it could also be just pragmatic in order to sort of integrate oneself with this community that you want to study. It can be helpful to eat the same food and to be a gracious guest. So just to give some examples for the students, a PhD student I met at the University of Alberta is vegetarian in Edmonton, but does research on the Inuit and eats seal when he's up north doing field work, and feels that would be unethical and would make his research more difficult too if he refused to eat food from the land that was being offered to him. And then also Beth Conklin's book, Compassionate Cannibalism. When I met Beth in Nashville and had a meal with her, it turns out she's vegetarian, and she has been forever, or since she was a teenager. But when she was doing that research for compassionate cannibalism, she ate monkey meat, and she talked about how that was really hard for her, but that was what the people she was studying one thing that they ate, and that they would roast the entire body, so with the head and the eyes and everything, so it wasn't disguised at all as a monkey, but she would eat that when she was doing the research, but then go back home and be vegetarian. And so those are just cases where people doing research have felt both pragmatically and ethically kind of compelled to eat meat when a guest. We've been talking a little bit about the issue of accommodation, and reading Sonora Taylor's work, arguing that it's okay to be a trouble to your host and to ask for accommodation around diet, just like around disability. So I wonder if, just on this general topic, you could say a bit about your thoughts, that article in particular, or how your thoughts developed since then.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I remember thinking about this because a lot of people around me were, maybe you could call them shy vegans, right? They were vegan at home, but they were always worried about their alienating their grandmothers or hurting their grandmother's feelings. They were also worried about their jobs, right? Especially if, well, it was pre-COVID, of course, right? And part of your job was taking your clients out for dinner, and what would they think, and would it sort of compromise your employment? And then there was also graduate students, right, who were concerned about refusing food, especially in terms of access to research participants. So my co-author and I were thinking about these ideas about difference and about how you build rapport, right? Does building a rapport with the community mean you have to behave like them? And that's sort of where this idea came from. And myself, I conduct research often with formerly incarcerated individuals, so very marginalized, and my co-author worked in non-Western settings. So we're trying to sort of parse the ethics of sincerity, I think, as well, right? Like, what does it mean to sort of hide one's politics in order to gain access? And I think ultimately we argued, and well, I know what we argued, but where it came from was this idea that to think that someone can't understand difference or one's difference, I think it's sort of this idea of thinking that your participant or those you do research with, your research participants, then have this sort of flattened subjectivity, right? That one cannot build a rapport across difference. So we thought that this sort of just represented an elitist and biased view that those we conduct research with were somehow incapable of accepting difference. If we thought, the individuals that knew we don't consume animal products could accept that difference, then why would we think that our research subjects or participants couldn't, right? Did we not offer or believe them to have the same level of critical thinking skills, whatever you might want to call it? So we just thought that was sort of an elitist view of the quote unquote other. So ultimately we argued that sincerity is more important to rapport than is sort of this feigning of similarity. But then we also wondered what it meant to think of community or about being a guest as only limited to those you're immediately sharing a table with. But if we think of community more broadly, as including the more than human world, animals, ecosystems, and those who are most impacted by climate change, then what hospitality ethics and politics are required. So ultimately, we argued that it would be ethically and politically acceptable to be clear about one's food or animal politics when engaging in research.
Thank you. This topic of being a guest relates to the issue of dietary accommodations, which, as I mentioned, we've been talking about in this class in relation to disability accommodations. And yet another topic on which you've written is laws concerning food accommodations and whether there should be a legal obligation to accommodate ethical and political diets, such as veganism, in the same way that there is a legal obligation in certain settings to accommodate religious and health-related dietary restrictions. So for instance, in institutions such as prisons. Can you say a little bit about your work on these topics?
Yes, of course. So recently, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, I think this was a few years ago, sort of made a short statement around the fact that creed is a protected area from discrimination, and that veganism would constitute creed if it met 5 criteria. And I won't go into those criteria, but basically, if it was a deeply held belief, if you were part of a community of like-minded individuals, etc., then you might have a creed, or your veganism might be considered a creed according to this human rights protected grounds. And then at the same time, the first successful charter challenge on Section 2B of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, freedom of conscience, was successfully brought forward by a vegetarian federal prisoner, Jack Maurice. So I was trying to think about these issues of food accommodation because I had been doing research with formerly incarcerated individuals who every time brought up the quality of food, and sort of not directly asked by me, we would just ask them questions like, well, how was the food inside? And do you want to share anything about that? We're also asking, like, how many times were you able to use a telephone? Were you able to access your lawyer? Stuff like this. They would just talk to the centrality of food. Like they would say, like, prison is, you can judge your experience of prison by the food you receive there. It's all gray, it's all mush, it's poisonous, it's scary, etc. So a lot of vegetarian prisoners were telling me the difficulty they had in accessing vegetarian diets. It had to be approved by sort of the chaplain or someone who was part of the medical staff. And then how other prisoners would sort of just, supplement their vegetarian prisoners' friends with things from their trays. So that was happening at the same time that sort of this notion of creed was sort of getting more immediate attention. And I know there's a current lawsuit before the tribunal about a vegetarian, or I think he's a vegan firefighter, that's being brought forth by Animal Justice. So there's these ideas of accommodation on the individual level. And at the same time, right, Canada's food guide changed and government institutions are required to provide diets based on the Canada Food Guide. But I was going inside prisons a lot for human rights oversight work, seeing that these diets weren't changing. So there were these issues sort of in my mind at the same time that I was reading a lot about the negative environmental implications of the prison. So not only do prisons do a lot of agriculture on their own grounds, they'll have prisoners raising animals, slaughtering animals, and processing their bodies to be consumed in prison diets, but they'll also sell these products to, especially in the US, stores like Whole Foods, although Whole Foods has now said they've severed their ties with prison labor. So it's this massive industry, prison agriculture on the inside, but running a prison is environmentally damaging. Prisons often pollute surrounding waterways, surrounding lands. So there's all these environmental implications of the prison. Most scholars who are critical of the prison from an environmental perspective don't attend at all to the diets. At one time where I'm thinking about individual accommodation of individual prisoners requesting vegetarian diets for a variety of reasons, there's also this idea of the production, I think, ecological damage through prison diets. So I don't have firm thoughts on this yet, but it's just something that's always in the back of my mind.
You've already begun to talk about this topic a little bit, but I wondered if you can tell us a little bit about how you've brought your work in food studies together with your work in prison studies, and particularly you've written not just about prison food, but about prison farms, which you started to mention a little bit before. What's your position on prison farms? Is this something a lot of people argue for them? This is kind of rehabilitative, pastoral work for prisoners to do, and that it might lead to them having gainful employment once they get out of prison. Do you want to say a little bit about those topics?
Yes, absolutely. So in Canada, in the federal system, prison animal ag has been around since predating Confederation. It ended in 2010 because it was just seen as too expensive and as not having any empirical evidence that it led to any rehabilitative outcomes. At the same time, slaughterhouse research shows that this is a very violent industry, which actually creates violence in the outside community. So why would you ask or expect that the raising, commodification, and slaughter and processing of animals would be rehabilitative, right? Those committed to bringing the farms back, and they are currently reopening, and they will reopen as massive goat dairies for a China-based infant formula producer, claim that this is a particular way that prisoners can learn empathy. But if you look at the actual mechanics of that type of labor, it is extremely precarious, socially sort of isolated, right? No one wants to do that type of labor. No one sort of respects individuals, I think, who do that type of labor, right? It's seen as sort of inhumane for many people. So it's dirty work that those with other choices will choose not to do. So in one sense, I think carceral slaughterhouse labor is in itself carceral, but you now have a captive population who have to follow their rehabilitation plans, and that will often include one type of employment within the prison in order to progress through their plan and have a favorable outcome at their parole hearing. So it's very cheap labor for surrounding communities, and they still are operating a slaughterhouse at one of the penitentiary grounds. It's under contract with a company called Wallace Beef. So it operates on penitentiary grounds, uses prisoner labor, and then sells to the outside. That's still operating. It's very cheap in the sense of they pay maybe $6 a day per individual working in the slaughterhouse. And then in the US, we're seeing an increase in this type of animal ag rehabilitation, quote unquote, because it's usually those with precarious immigration statuses who are funneled into these types of labor fields. But if you have anti-immigration policies, which increased under Trump, then you have a reduced labor pool. So they're turning back to convict leasing in order to fill those gaps. So there's nothing rehabilitative about this. The empirical evidence completely shows the opposite, but you now have a captive labor pool that you can pay. Some correctional administrations pay prisoners no money at all for participating. Some pay 50 cents a day, some pay $4 a day. So it keeps and sustains the prison as something that is economically viable and saves the prison quite a bit of money and generates profit.
And it saves the animal agriculture corporations as well.
Absolutely. Yes, they just subcontract to the prison, and then the prison will either house the animal agriculture on its own grounds, or they will transport prisoners to other farms to do the labor and then bring them back at the end of the day. That's one way in which I'm thinking about sort of these intersections of technologies of enclosure being the prison, being animal agriculture, in the location of the prison itself. And as well, future research, I'd really like to sort of start thinking about hunger strikes and the role of that as complicating punishment.
Thank you. Such interesting work. So my very last question is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, during your PhD at the University of Alberta, you taught the Feminism and Food course several times. So I wondered if you have any memories or experiences or insights from teaching this class that you'd like to share with the current cohort of WGS 240 students.
Yes, I just recall that it was always such a strong and interesting class, right? Food is intimate, it's political. A lot of times people think it's very private, but when you start sort of, if you want to use the metaphor of like peeling back the layers of the onion or whatever other food metaphor you'd like, becomes so apparent how public and political food really is, right? From our national and regional identities to constituting a large proportion of our GDP, especially in Canada. At one point, it was one of the nations that actually produced more food than it consumed. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but I think it's such an important time right now to be thinking about food and especially how it's produced in terms of agricultural power, agriculture itself, how animals are caged and treated, and how there's really no strong barrier between us and them in terms of human and animal, if you want to think about that way, or us in the more than human world. And that's not, COVID-19, I think, is just bringing these issues into incredibly sharp focus in a way that I think this is such an important time to be thinking about the issues that this class has the space to do that.